Wet Palette, arguably the most important tool after paints and brushes. So let's find out which one is the best. This video is sponsored by Titanforge. Hey everyone, you're watching Squidmar Miniatures, I'm Emil. By the way, if you're not subscribed, do that, because I release hobby videos every week. So, the Wet Palette, I've been using it pretty much since I started painting miniatures, and I would say that it's probably the most important tool and the tool that helped me develop the quickest outside of a better paintbrush. So I'm a little bit of a wet palette addict. I've got a few of them right here. And a few weeks back I got the Jazz's Ultimate Creativity Collection. And by the way, I'm really excited to try out the sculpture box, but I'm gonna get to that another week. In the Minis Mega Box we have the Masterson's STA-WET Palette. And why in the world would I be excited about that? Well, I've never tried the STA-WET palette, and when I got started with miniature painting, pretty much anyone who I was watching on YouTube, anyone who I was looking at images from on Instagram had the STA-WET palette. So now that I have one, I want to see what the fuss was all about, why was everyone using this one, why was everyone recommending it, and how does it hold up to the P3, the Army Painter, the Redgrass game ones. I have both of the sizes here, and see which ones I think is the best and which one I think you should choose depending on which situation in life you are right now. So let's compare 5 wet palettes to figure out which one is the best. Number 1. I've been using the Redgrass Games XL wet palette for the better part of 2 years now, and they have 2 different versions, the small one and the big one. And the small one I think is a little bit too small for the way that I paint, so I'm gonna talk mainly about the XL one today. And I've really enjoyed the design of the XL wet palette, as it lets me load a lot of paint into the palette, and that creates a natural flow for me where I can front load when I start painting and then just use the palette and not having to move up, change, add paints, whatever, during a painting session. Another thing that I really enjoy about this one is the form factor. It's an incredibly low wet palette, by far the lowest one of the wet palettes we're comparing today. And it's got some really cool features with a snap-on magnetized dry palette as well. And Redgrass Games have their own type of paper, which are pre-cut for the wet palettes that you bought, both for the small one and the big one. And as someone who, as I mentioned, want an easy workflow, it's perfect. When I want to change the paper, I don't have to cut anything, bring out scissors, knives, or whatever. And the paper for me is one of the most positive things. I just love the way that it keeps the paints moist. I don't get this dry film on top of the paint when it's been in the palette for a while. There are a few negatives, however. For one, the price. It's definitely the most expensive one of the bunch. The big one I think is $55, the small one I think is... And another one is that the seals are too good. You have these rubber seals that just shuts it tight, and it creates this sort of trapment of moist, which makes the paints too wet when it's in the palette and it's closed. So I always have to leave a part of the palette open so that some of the water that evaporates can leave the palette. But I guess that's a small thing, because most of the time I switch out the paper whenever I restart, because even if the humidity is perfect, there's always 1 or 2 paints that have separated a bit, so I like to switch out the paper pretty much every time I start anew. But for those of you who want to keep the paint for the next painting session, depending on your humidity, you might have to leave it more open than you think. And the negatives with the small one, well, price and size. Pretty much it. Number 2, Masterson STA-WET Palette. So the big competitor and the oldest one in the game is the Masterson's STA-WET Palette. I must admit, the design is quite a lot more simple and feels more dated than the Redgrass Games one, but there's something about it that I like. And it's a fairly big one. It's the closest one in size to the XL Redgrass Games one, but still a bit smaller. To me, I consider whenever the size is bigger, it's better in terms of wet palettes, but the Masterson, for my type of painting, is quite well enough. It's really big enough for all of the different paints I need for a project, and so far I have yet to fill it up for a single painting session, so that's a positive. It's a few millimeters taller than the Redgrass Games one, but that ergonomical change is really minuscule. I really don't feel the difference when I use them. But for the other parts, I think the way that it seals the palette, the Masterson is actually better. It keeps my paints better without me having to leave half of the palette open overnight. The functionality of the sponge, again, is very similar to the Redgrass Games. I have not noticed any difference when I use them. The papers that I get with the Masterson is terrible. I know that everyone has said this in blogs and in video reviews, but I had to try for myself and it was just terrible. It's made for a completely different type of paint, and I really get that now, because it's almost like putting your paint on a normal piece of paper. So what I have to do is I have to cut some from parchment paper, which I think is okay. We have some at home. I don't like the process of having to cut them, so I would just pre-cut like 10 or 15 of them to have them ready for when I paint. It's a small thing, but it is a thing you have to do. And I've been using this for about a week now, trying it out, and I've only had one tiny issue, and that's compared to the paper that I get from Redgrass Games. I get this dried film whenever I left the paint on the palette for a while, and it really doesn't change the way I use it, but whenever I come back to the palette, I have to remove like a dry film of paint from each small paint puddle on this one. But then the positive is I did not have the same problem with separation as I have with the Redgrass Games one. So I guess you win some, you lose some. I would say they're about equally in terms of use. However, as a sort of final thing with the Masterson one, on Amazon right now, I know this goes up and down, but right now it's $11.50. And that price is 1/5 of the price of the Redgrass Games one. So that for me is a really big positive. So Masterson, I really enjoyed it. It's been working really fine. The size is good. It's a nice bucket. Number 3, Army Painter. Very similar in size to the orange one from Redgrass Games. Army Painters seem to have been inspired quite a lot in terms of material choices for their wet palette as what Redgrass Games use. The sponge feels very much the same and the papers do as well. And this of course means that I really like the way it works. The edge is slightly higher, but it's really not enough for me to complain about it. I think it's really good. And they have a really cool design feature where you can keep all of the paint brushes that you want to have with you when you travel in the wet palette. So it really saves you on space and it keeps your brushes safer. But whenever I've gone to a friend, I've actually always traveled with my brushes in the Army Painter wet palette instead of bringing the big Redgrass Games one. So I guess they've got me on that one. Again, for the way that I paint, where I load up a lot of paints and kind of mix around on the palette, I feel like I really want a little bit more surface. So that's my only negative, but the price and the feel and the quality, I think is really good for this one. So if you're one who don't have a lot of space or move around a lot when you paint different tables or go to friends, etc., I think this might be your choice. But let me talk about the remaining 2 options we have before you decide. And this week, I'm incredibly happy to have a short message from Titanforge, who's been kind to support my work the whole year by sponsoring a few videos. Titanforge have 2 3D printable miniature Patreons, one for sci-fi miniatures and one for fantasy. Because they've become the biggest 3D printable miniature brand on the internet, it means that they've been able to deliver a ridiculous quality month in, month out. Every month, Titanforge and Cyberforge have some sweet looking models, jam-packed with heroes, monsters, big vehicles. They have amazing welcome bonuses. And if you decide to stay for more than 3 months, you get an awesome loyalty bonus. Now in December, Titanforge have a release with Arabian Night, with gins, shakes, a huge sandstorm, and like a lot more. Over on the other hand, they have Cyberforge with a double miniature month, which means that for the same price, you're getting 2 different packs. One half of them being Cyberpunk, second one is Starship Crew, and additionally they have a Starship model. I myself have been a Titanforge pledger for about a year now, and I printed a lot of the miniatures, and I can totally confirm that the quality is top-notch, definitely one of the best on the market. And in terms of value for what you pay, they're ridiculously hard to beat. Just check out this week's models and you'll understand what I mean. So if you're interested in either Titanforge or Cyberforge, I put both of the links in the video description. Thanks so much again, Titanforge, for supporting this channel. Let's go on with testing wet palette. Number 4, P3 wet palette. So the P3 wet palette is a bit of a dark horse because not a lot of people have heard about this one, but it's actually been around for quite a long time. But the thing is, when it comes to wet palette, the bigger, the better. And I think P3 kind of didn't get the memo on this. I know the palette has been around for a long time before the bigger ones was around, but it's about a third of the size of the XL from Redgrass Games. And the painting surface is less than half of the Masterson. So you kind of see where I'm going with this. Another problem that we had locally with the P3 one is that whenever you used a paper on the P3 and maybe you went away for lunch or something and came back 2 hours later, the paper would have broken down due to the water in the palette, and that's kind of not what's supposed to happen with the paper. It's supposed to keep the paint wet. And if the paper breaks down with that, I don't know, you're kind of missing the point. You can, of course, cut parchment paper or whatever to make it work for you. But then again, would you pay for this and this sponge when a lunchbox that you would get for free in a Happy Meal pretty much has the same size, and you can take a cellulose sponge cloth that you have at home and you have the same quality. So this is kind of a loser for me. It's not terrible, but I'm not a big fan of the sponge, the papers, or the size, so I'm sorry P3 on this one. You didn't win. Number 5, homemade wet palette. So a homemade wet palette, you might think that it's just pure poo-poo in the garbage bin, but a homemade wet palette can actually be incredibly good. A Tupperware can, a cookie jar, or whatever you have at home. Maybe do like Marco Frisoni and take these Ferrero Rocher boxes that look pretty much perfect for a wet palette. Add the sponge cloth and parchment paper and you're good to go. In terms of usage, it's gonna be pretty much identical to the Masterson, or if you use a regular parchment paper instead of the Army Painter or Redgrass Games ones on those palettes, they're gonna feel exactly the same. The problem for me, I didn't find that cool box that Marco have, and these ones are a bit too high for me. In terms of ergonomics, I would have to move the brush up a bit too much whenever I would refill the paint, and the Tupperware ones I have are a bit too small for my taste. But if you can't find a good box at home, you find the sponge cloth, which I have put in the video description links, so you can pick them up from Amazon if you like. You've got a pretty much free wet palette. And the cellulose sponge cloths I think are incredible. I think they're equally good to all of the different ones we've used, maybe even better than the P3 sponge that they have in their wet palette. So the free one, which is pretty much as good as the other ones, should do you for a very, very long time. And if you want to see more on how I did it and how to use it, of course I made a video on that, so I will put that video link up in this corner right now. So to the conclusion, what are my favorites? Well, I have, I would say, 2 favorites, and then of course the free one, which is free, so everyone should do it before you go out and buy one, just to try it out. The first favorite is the Masterson one. It's 11 bucks for a perfect box, a perfect sponge. All you have to do is cut the parchment papers and you're good to go. For that price, I think it's probably the most bang for a buck. Another positive is that it's available on Amazon, so most countries can get the Masterson, most hobby stores can get these, so it's hard to beat. But I'm a big lover of the Redgrass Game one. I think the positivity with the nice paper that they have and that I don't have to cut the papers pushes sort of the final grade of this one up a little bit, but I still kind of think the $55 is worth the price if you have money to spare. But if you have other hobby tools you need to buy, like brushes, more paints, new miniatures, well, no, you don't need more miniatures, but you get the point. If you got other stuff to spend the 40 extra bucks on, I would probably take the Masterson over this one. But if money is not an object, I will still probably keep the Army Painter for when I travel, so I will have 3 that I use on a daily basis. But these 2 are definitely my favorites. The Masterson one, as I mentioned, I have an Amazon link in the video description down below. So with that, I hope you learned something. Hit the subscribe button, smash like if you feel like you had a bit of fun today. If you've been enjoying my content, there's a couple of ways you can support this channel, either by going on Patreon and pledging a few dollars every month, or if you're intrigued by any of the gear that I use in my videos. I have 99% of it on my website listed with affiliate links, so if you're ever gonna buy something, feel free to visit squidmar.com and follow any of those links to pick up the gear that I use. for your hobby adventures. A massive, massive thanks to this week's sponsor, Titanforge. Please check out their link in the video description if you're intrigued by their product as well. And a massive shout out to all of my top Patreon supporters. Seriously guys, I know I say this every week, but without you guys I would not be able to run this channel and do it the way that I do. So I'm incredibly thankful for everything. With that, have a great day.